Welcome to the Coursera YouTube Masterclass unit. It's fine to be here. We're representing Harvard, USC, and Calarts with Coursera credit for taking the YouTube Masterclass that I'm running on film criticism. This is about as close as you can come to starting the class and see all the other episodes by the end of the term, which is in about 8 weeks literally, and more like 4 or 5 weeks for us considering what we're able to do. The music in the background is kind of loud. I may have to adjust that accordingly, and there are other interruptions we're subject to, but for the most part, we're teaching a straight class on cinema studies and how to approach film studies and what makes film criticism. Now, film criticism is an approach to film studies and is a writing about film studies, how films work, how they're made, how old movies were made, if they're even that old, because 100 years is barely as old as some of the oldest people on Earth. So, but that it's 125 years now is kind of guessable between where the origin falls and a guesstimate to where we're at now, which is added to a 1 because of the turn of the century. But we're talking about Westerns. Straight up Westerns. And remember, in one of my books, I pointed out that a lot of Westerns are either captured the flag where we search for the flag, like the Searchers kind of Western, which is color and is a big 1950s super Western that uses widescreen and color palettes of Zion, Monument Valley, all these like shots of the West, the way it was nostalgically remembered by, although audiences in the 50s thought that it looked like 1850 or when the Western was taking place, and it probably did look like that because they had meticulous detailers at the big studios that would go in and check and make sure that the Westerns were realistic enough that that's what the actual people that were in the Old West looked like and acted like and talked like, and that the stars of these movies, in this particular one, this is the best example of a defend the flag, capture the flag, because what it is they take a prisoner in. John Wayne takes a prisoner in, but he's not really in big trouble, but they've got to keep him alive until they decide whether he's guilty or not. He's probably guilty, but we never really find out whether he's guilty or not, because they'd have to defend him like they're defending a flag, because they're coming to take him out of the prison and kill him, which may be what they have to do inside the prison to get him to stop scrounging about how he's an outlaw. And they do try to protect him, though. It's got that Hateful Eight ring to it. It's Rio Bravo, and it's one of the best Westerns ever made, and if you can't watch it 50 times, try, but that's okay. I've only seen it about 22 times. No, I'm kidding. I've seen it about 18 times. That was an extra added for what I intended to watch it recently, but that I have most of it memorized, and that there's all kinds of great things in it, like a song by Ricky Nelson, which is sang in the movie. And it's so beautiful that they put it on the soundtrack for Rio Bravo, which is so hard to track down. But I hear again, my professor friend Ethan Thompson tells me that you can track down the soundtrack to Rio Bravo and an album by Ricky Nelson that may or may not have the song from the movie Rio Bravo, which is definitely on the Rio Bravo soundtrack, but doesn't necessarily come up on Ricky Nelson's greatest hits, although it could. And it may have made a later cassette tape of that. I'm not really sure how they measured that song out other than the Rio Bravo soundtrack, but that there are Ricky Nelson songs that are similar to it on his actual albums is true, and that some of them are inspired by the very song is the nature of cowboy poetry music, and that's just a beautiful thing. And these guys are all wearing guns in the back part. They all have to go out on a mission at the end and have the high noon shot, where they're all coming in, and the bad guys are outnumbering the good guys, and the good guys are, usually wearing lighter hats, because the lighter the hat, the more justice they are. That's symbolizing justice. In like the Western, it's later in the modern era, because see, this is like post-war, post-classical, and that's an era that there's people in the nuclear family that want to see movies like Rebel Without a Cause, but now they're watching Westerns for it, and if this isn't Rebel Without a Cause later in the Western form, I'm telling you it is. In the color scheme it is, and John Wayne's big acting moves that Howard Hawks planned out ever since Red River, when he actually got a performance out of him that John Ford didn't even describe as his usual stalemate, which is what John Ford usually went for, which I don't really think John Wayne was that bad. I think he's one of the greatest actors, and I know I'm going to be crucified for identifying this with a class, but John Wayne is like Charlie Chaplin to me, and I know Charlie Chaplin meant a lot more to the downtrodden soul that gives him great soul, but John Wayne is a hero in how he actually, in most of his movies, heroically rescues, playing the dreamer football player that does mysteriously rescue women and stuff. That women don't really need John Wayne to rescue them. I don't know. Maybe they probably like the idea of someone like John Wayne rescuing them. I mean, he's such a nice guy. He's got good characteristics. You know, he's got a few bad habits, but they're not that drastic, and that you can learn how to act and behave just from watching him is kind of nice, because he's a pretty good role model and only got a little wasted a few times. And I mean, you know, he's an actor and he has his liberties, and we don't have to pry into his personal life, but that he never came out as like some kind of strange creature as a celebrity is cool. But that a lot of people put him on the redneck channel is fine. I don't mind rednecks, but rednecks have a place in cinema without being considered, you know, just ignorant of the fact. But John Wayne is the leader of a certain cult of cinema that will never go away, and that is where a magnet movie star makes it so huge that he still resonates with box office today and still generates the stardom quality, whether you like him or not. He's still a household name, and everybody knows who John Wayne is. That Dean Martin and Ricky Nelson weren't far behind, in that they're all squashed in an Assault Precinct 13 area where they're destined to keep alive the guy they gotta kill, in case the guys that come to kill him can kill him first, which we're gonna kill if they try to kill him. That's a gun standoff you don't want to miss. Now we got to back up a little bit and go to why did the Western film go from Iron Horse, which we will cover at a later time. It's a silent film. We could have covered Iron Horse now. Just say it's John Ford directing a super Western for the last time in the 20s, waiting then for the sound era to come in the 30s. And then in 1937, Stagecoach was planned, but there was already a slew of John Ford movies at Fox that were piling up that weren't Westerns, but they were well choreographed sound films. And The Prisoner of Shark Island example and The Informer were such complex sound designs that they decided they could go back to the Western genre. And John Ford was looking forward to it, because then he brought John Wayne back in from Three Bad Men, which was a silent film that John Ford met John Wayne and promised him he could be in Stagecoach. And I'm telling you, the Stagecoach is a rockin' good movie. The only scene they had to cut out was one of the Stagecoach kind of crashing, and they decided that everyone would die in that shot if they were really in that ship of Stagecoach ship that they were in. And so they cut that scene out, but other than that, it's pretty realistic. I mean, the costume detail is just like I was talking about in Rio Bravo. Now, this is a capture the flag and defend the flag when you get there movie. It's the ultimate Western. All Westerns come from this, Union Pacific and Dodge City, because that's when the sound Western, super Western came back in. And that there's a few examples in the 30s of Westerns doesn't make sense, because like the genre wasn't really revived until Stagecoach came out and made a B movie into an A movie. But that there were B movie Westerns before Stagecoach that didn't have John Wayne in it doesn't exactly clear up the fact that there should be easier to find if there's Westerns back there, and should have been by John Ford, who left the Iron Horse always wanting to make another Western, even though he was under contract at Fox, who allowed him period pieces of the most lavish decadence and weren't really saying no on a Western. They just all waited until the rest of the studios had one coming out, and had one technically wired for sound the way they needed to from 37 to 39. They wired it and finally got these theaters to carry these really high quality sound machines through the speaker production, through the equalizer in the back room. And Stagecoach booms along, it sings along with cowboy poetry again, it rides along, it's like riding a train. You're always in the Stagecoach. John Carradine's in it, all-star cast, you know. Clarence Rivard plays the prostitute with a heart of gold that falls in love with John Wayne, his outlaw self, being this movie that turned into stardom. But I'm not real sure what color hat he wears in this, and it doesn't have it on the back. This is the Criterion version, though, and it's a decent copy. And that Rio Bravo disc ain't nothing to snuff about, even though it's actually from the Target collection. And this Stagecoach copy was directly from Criterion, and I got to put in a spot for Criterion, because they carry the best Blu-rays and the best quality of a special edition features that they can find. And this one is loaded with good stuff. Like, it's got Harry Goulding's key role in bringing Monument Valley to Hollywood. I mean, it's kind of interesting stuff on Stagecoach. That this movie was a big studio production was rare because they hadn't done that really in that way, except for in B movies. Now that John Ford used to direct westerns before Iron Horse was key, because he had Three Bad Men was before Iron Horse, remember, and it was remade into Three Godfathers by John Ford, who remade himself a couple of times. But the earlier films by John Ford, you see, were not only assigned from Fox, but they weren't tripped back to until you see the one that John Ford made about the Mormons called Wagon Train. And I had a copy of that somewhere, but if I get to it later, we'll see. But it's where Ward Bond is taking his Mormons across the Pioneer Track. That's exactly like the story was told in the Mormon Church. And it's funny because John Ford revised that as though it's a mythology that's important, like he does in Quiet Man and The Sun Shines Bright. And in Mogambo, it's kind of characteristic of that taboo, kind of overblown expression of like what love can be like on a train. That they're convincingly in love in Mogambo is later John Ford and kind of boring. But that they fought off set is always interesting for Juicy Gossip. Now, John Ford didn't really take Juicy Gossip kindly because in some of the best westerns, not really Stagecoach, but later on when John Wayne was further in his career and had already made Rio Bravo, one of the next ones he made, or around the same time that he made Rio Bravo, he made one for John Ford called The Searchers. Now in Rio Bravo, he's really humbled to be back with Howard Hawks, who had already done some movies that completely blew his mind, but had only been in Red River with him, and they planned on two-peating also upon John Ford's favor, but John Ford really pushed the Howard Hawks performance of John Wayne losing his mind out in the Valley of the Monuments again, where he went in Stagecoach country. He goes in The Searchers, and that's the top one here. We also see The Wild Bunch and How the West Was Won, which we'll talk about next, but we'll have to get back to John Ford. But the point is The Informer won an Oscar. 3 of his documentaries about the U.S. Army won Oscars. And I think it was How Green Was My Valley won an Oscar. So yeah, The Quiet Man may or may not have won Best Actor, but John Wayne was starting to get suspiciously driven by him pleasing the actors and his strange change of being ever since he'd been in those movies, like even Red River with Montgomery Clift, who had kind of showed him some acting skills, and they had kind of learned that. And John Wayne really brings it out in The Searchers, which has totally captured the flag. Go and siege the flag because they're getting a girl back that was related to them that was killed in an Indian attack that they should have been at, but were tricked by Indians to leave the house. And then the Indians capture the girl. They leave no one alive except the girl. They take her into bondage. And for 5 years, John Wayne goes looking for him. Now, this is the one that's notorious for having a post-cinematic experience on The Searchers. Because there is people that watch this film in like a 5-year period that spread out the pictures of the film one by one. It's 24 frames a second typically on this launch. Well, if it's 24 frames a second, then that means there's 24 frames. How's that mathematically going to add up if I slow down a 3-hour film or a 2-hour and 45-minute film with the ultimate 5-day stretch, which is 5 times 24 hours, a lot more than the movie's length. So you slow it down. Pictures play for like an hour at a time before they shift even into the next frame to get it in 5 years. Maybe that ratio is a little off, but what I'm saying is that is supposedly the longest movie ever made, the 5-year version of The Searchers, and it takes place over 5 years. And what's strange about it is they kind of noticed a coincidence, but not really in where the time is in the movie, whether it's further on in a year, but there's a place that skips like 2.5 to 3 years in there, seemingly in The Searchers, that like is kind of like Django Unchained, like all of a sudden we're in a totally different area doing something else, maybe the same way that we did years ago, but it might have been only days that passed, But the subtitle makes it sure that we know 5 years has elapsed since the time that their niece was kidnapped by Indians and to the time that they find her and get her back, and that they find her and get her back, and John Wayne's still going boatload crazy on trying to get rid of the Indians. the faults of some of these westerns would be that many of them were plotted around cowboys and Indians, that there was warfare among cowboys and Indians, not as much as cowboys and bandits, we have to say, attributes to the Hollywood glamorization of mythology, tropes that have gone back to our civilization since colonization occurred. And I'm not saying that these aren't the capitalists throw money at the movie, who cares what we see, but we do care what we see, and what we see is visual poetry told at its highest medium. That it's a capitalist venture and pretty much promotes the idea that, like, the Indians were killed unfairly but fairly is a thought that doesn't even really question where we're supposed to be with political correctness. And I find it to be interesting in some westerns, like Dead Man, for instance, with Johnny Depp, that there's such a friendship with the Indians, including Little Big Man and Outlaw Josie Wells. And Outlaw Josie Wells, I'd just like to mention, was Clint Eastwood. And Clint Eastwood is coming up in this lecture, so don't miss that. But what I'm getting at is that, you see, The Searchers was the one where John Wayne almost wants to destroy his niece when he finds her, because she's even speaking Indian. She's been with the Indians for 5 years, grown up with them. She's uncomfortable with going back with these big dudes with guns that are coming to scare her and kill all of her Indian friends if they are friends. But then she still wants to come back, and he kind of wants to, I don't know, take off without her because she's turned Indian. And so there's this idea that, like, the racism is questioned because we're going like, yeah, but this is your niece, and then really we're the ones being racist anyway by saying, well, she should be taken back from the Indians and given back to the white people, whereas, like, not only did they deserve revenge for at that point, but, like, no one would say, like, you should fight with an Indian for any reason. But there is a reason in The Searchers to fight with the Indians, so doesn't that automatically bring up the question of racism as it is? That John Wayne goes stark racism enough to think that his own niece has already become an Indian is so racist that they, like, present it as that in the movie. They're like, we're not surprised that you took it this way, because we're adding up to the fact that we're doing everything we can to show him that John Wayne has gone snaptitude against even Indian religion, because there's a line in the movie, John Wayne shoots this Indian in the eyes, and when he shoots him in one eye, he flips the gun around and shoots him in the other eye, and it cuts back and forth between the dead Indian and the shots, and he's like, what'd you do that for? You know, his friend asks, that's, like, already called a half-breed because he's somehow related to Indians way back, or his grandparents are, so he's somehow a half-breed, and that's part of the racism that's brought up, and it's great, because he's still a friend, but he can't believe that his ears about this, and he's like, why'd you shoot him? And he's going on the search, too, and it's just when the search is getting started, and he's like, by what you preach, Reverend, none, but by what that Comanche believes. If he ain't got no eyes, can't find his way into the spirit land. Gotta wander between the winds. You get it, Reverend. Come on, Blanket Head. And I know Blanket Head's going to offend all my friends in the Middle East, and I don't want it to, but he's totally he's totally dissing that guy for being a half-breed, and it's so obviously wrong that he's doing it, that the whole performance is wrong, and that, like, we still forgive him even though he, like, doesn't want to take his niece back after coming all this way to rescue her. What else could he do? Is it like he cuts everybody else off on the mission and starts killing extra buffaloes so that all the Indians will die because they'll have nothing to feed on? Well, is that the reason buffaloes went extinct? Or did buffaloes not go extinct until Bill Murray played Where the Buffalo Roam? I can't come right now.
DEA, open up immediately.
I can't, dude.
Oh, DEA, dude. I'm going to have to bust the door down.
Please, I'm doing a show right now. Sorry, we got interrupted all of a sudden. I'm sorry, folks. That was normal, but that they wouldn't stop questioning why I couldn't come to the door, I'll have to find out later. But anyways, we're talking about the Wild Bunch now, because I think we just got wrapped on the Searchers for getting wrapped on the door. And I told you we'd have interruptions before we started. And it's probably staff not approving that I have a class, or that they think it's cool to keep talking during it, but whatever. Anyway, this is the next movie on the list is The Wild Bunch, and we're going to take it even a step further than The Searchers and say that's another Capture the Flag, although it's more like Capture the Treasure, Capture the Weapons, Capture the League of Friends that are all badass mofos on horseback, and it's Sam Peckinpah come to the movies, although he's been there quite a few years, and it's been a while back that Ride the High Country comes out of Sam Peckinpah's legendary "Let's edit the shit out of this Western and make all the action look even more real, and we'll propagate the action like a propaganda film, but only in a right wing. Everybody's got a gun, and we're all going down shooting kind of way." And that's the way these Westerns are, because they all go down shooting in the Searchers, but they scalp the Indians in the Searchers as another tribute to that they've gone as primitive as their colonial side could get on the primitive style. Now, that the Searchers is like a post-war film, and the Wild Bunch is the kind of pangs of Vietnam film, is because Vietnam's on TV now in 1969, and a lot of people, although they might be seeing it in black and white or in color, they're seeing a lot of war footage. So now the Wild Bunch is gonna like be in the middle of the Civil War, like a lot of Westerns really are. You know, they have, like, even the Searchers has a reference to the fact that there's Yankees and that there's Confederates and that there's these different sides to the Southern captains. And like in John Ford, you get both Northern and Southern captains out of John Wayne. Like even in a series of movies like She Wore a Yellow Ribbon in Rio Grande, he's already wearing one side and we know he's worn the other, and it was just in another movie that he wore the other. And in The Quiet Man, he's just a boxer, but in all these Westerns, like The Searchers, he comes out as the star of John Ford, who actually had to hold a gun to him a couple of times to say that they were gonna actually like shoot anyone that left the set, because people were planning on mutinying, even because it was getting difficult to shoot, even in Monument Valley under the conditions they were in. And John Ford's put him in conditions, not risky conditions though, because in the She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, there's a tornado that blows, and they film it, and they see the tornado blowing, and you're like, that's a real tornado. So that you see a real tornado blowing wasn't that they were in too far of range for the tornado to get hit by it. They had measured already how far they could be away from it. Somehow they got that measurement. I don't know, would they take a tape measure all the way to the tornado? I don't know, but they get a lot of things out of John Ford, and one of them is entertainment. Because Westerns are entertaining genre, and they may be American, and they may be a little racist with their anti-Indian stuff, but in Little Big Man and Outlaw Josie Wells, you see just the opposite, because Outlaw Josie Wells relies on his Indian companion to get through all of his misadventures. And when Clint Eastwood's filming his movies, there's always a shot of him alone, and he's always looking anguished from like the despair, but that he can handle the despair, and he's going to turn it into his own heroism through the despair, is why I love this movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which does the hat thing again, only this time they're all wearing grayish to darkish hats on the cover, and I don't know if that reflects the white hat he's wearing out back, but that they always make a commentary on what color hats they wear, whether I know what the code means or not. It means something like the Son of God is light and the Son of Darkness is dark, and that's like this Manichaean trait of the Western genre, that he's the man with no name in this is also a tarot card reading of the hanged man, that he comes to rescue a town from its despair and gets both of the gangs of the town fighting each other. It's straight out of the script of Yojimbo, which we were going to talk about Kurosawa, as Rashomon later became John Ford's Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Juggling movies now. And The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is a remake of Rashomon, although it's only told from 3, maybe 4 perspectives, not necessarily of Liberty Valance's, who is Lee Marvin, who eventually gets shot by either John Wayne, his black friend, or that plays Sergeant Rutledge in John Ford's other movies, and Jimmy Stewart, who gets literally whipped to pieces almost irrecognizably by the evil Lee Marvin, Liberty Valance. And they all take a shot at him, and one of them killed him, but the movie's totally unclear about it. That Rashomon clarifies in a weird way that the female was the one that initiated the whole thing but didn't mean to. It was kind of a razz on saying, well, females aren't innocent, but yes, they are. But in this one, it's more like the Yojimbo scenography, where the only women are the women that are in trouble, and you're trying to help them out. And yes, there were strong women in John Ford, but that they always had to train the men to go do the things they had to do, means that where is the John Ford history of Annie Oakley, for instance? Why is the female Western star always subjugate to the man saving her, and that's because that's where entertainment for most of the genre pictures of the Western, whether they're in B movie mode or A movie mode, they're about romance, and the romance always brings one subjugate to the other. And I'm not saying that these are anti feminist, but these are strong women that probably could have beat the living heck out of Liberty Valance if they wanted to and chased them out of town. But in the movie that they even try, and that Liberty Valance is being abusive to women, is the last straw. And that's when they rise their bullets to him, which in a Western, you can never really rise your bullets to anyone and really mean it. That's why in the Wild Bunch, when all these people in the Prohibition era get shot at, they come down on the stream of consciousness that they just killed the Prohibition League. And in fact, if they killed the Prohibition League, they're never going to forgive themselves, but they have to move on and keep fighting the government, even though the government killed some of the Prohibition League, and that they waited till that day to draw them out, doesn't mean they planned on killing anyone innocent. The innocent lives are taken reminds us of Vietnam and why this movie was made as a protest, yet we've got to keep sending people to do it because they're defending the treasure of the lost hoard, which in Sam Peckinpah's mind is capitalism. And if we're defending treasure, we're defending the capital of even the Mexican guy who joined our team, and we promised to give him his share of the weapons as long as he stays on our team as far as we need him, and then he gets abandoned, and we go on a mission to save him? That doesn't sound like your typical Western, because here we have an interplay where the Indians are not the bad guys. One thing the Wild Bunch forgets is that, like, in all Westerns, except it, even Deadly Companions by Peckinpah, the Indians are usually the bad guys. And there's always like some clear-cut bad guy, but in the Wild Bunch, the villains are the anti-hero good guys. They're the antithesis of a non-hero, though, and they're superhuman Western heroes that they're already aged, is because these guys have been in tons of movies, and even the girls they get with are subjugate, but they're at least realistic people in this movie. They're not the types that take lack of realism kindly, because not only is the montage executing that they got every shot possible of every angle, it's also saying we're quietly defining what it's like to become a legend as an actor in your own right and still fall apart before the camera by reenacting the way you would feel if this is happening. So the Wild Bunch gets it. I mean, just for one Western not being about Indians at all, not pro, not con, not like an Indian is harbingering us or anything. That the Indians aren't related to the blacklist or anything is weird. That there's not really outlaws other than the ones that they are, and we're all following them like they're the heroes. So that they have a Mexican friend and no real Indian enemy, of course they become Mexico's enemy when the friend doesn't turn over the guns to the right guerrillas. And as we all know about guerrillas, they switch sides anyway, so for the Wild Bunch to go in there, they're going to have to mow down everybody, which it's a last man standing Yojimbo mess of what happens. And I'm not going to tell you that the jump cuts are like shot A, someone gets shot and starts falling from a cliff. Shot B, someone standing on the ground with a gun. Shot C, the person falling. And then shot B, back to the Wild Bunch about to light a fuse on a tank of gas that's going to blow up. Now, how the West was won, I only need to mention for a couple of reasons. It's kind of a B-movie Western for the whole family and is kind of cute. But it's about 4 hours long, and it has all these industry things about how the Old West is this nostalgia we have to look back at. That it's a 60s Western, and it has a John Ford moment that lasts 10 minutes, and everyone can only remember that from the film, and that Jimmy Stewart builds a canoe, and a few other details, is because most of it's in this widescreen format that can't even be captured on most TVs. Even a widescreen TV would have difficulty getting to the three sides of the triptych that are building Cinerama, which the How the West Was Won, it even says on this Blu-ray, the misleading title Cinerama, because you can't have Cinerama until you have 3 aspect ratio to 1. And it's another thing that they're doing to modulate from TV. They're saying, hey, TV is big, and they're still calling us out to this era. But they're saying, hey, TV is big. that How the West was won is bigger. It's the biggest movie you can ever see, and that there's other big movies. Like I've seen posters for an earthquake movie that's in Cinerama, and I've seen posters for an earthquake movie where in the theater they made the earthquake movement, like they made the seats buzz by putting little buzzers under them during the earthquake, so you feel like you're in the earthquake the whole movie, and that'd be the whole movie because the earthquake hits in the first 5 minutes. No, I'm kidding. But then there's that thing in Robert Altman where they're doing the kind of shortcuts thing, and everything's going fine, and then all of a sudden all these plots derail, and some come together and some don't. It's cutting from character to character, like Robert Altman was even doing clear back in Nash, and now he's shortcuts in the 80s. He's cutting everywhere, and then the earthquake hits. It's like everybody's affected by the earthquake. That's how we're all connected, because we were one of the 5 million people in the earthquake, but that's really the only way we were connected, except for like 5 out of 10 of us somehow intersected stories, but didn't intersect 3 ways, or maybe did a couple of times. But that the 10 people didn't intersect 3 ways, except maybe a couple of times, is still a delay on how I've seen the kind of montage taken from Peckinpah and used for like character differentiation. And I love that Robert Altman has a different politic than Sam Peckinpah, but that they're both TV directors and have a meticulous detail of what's cinematic without really competing with TV, using the TV knowledge to set up some of their booms, their cranks, their wide shots. You have telephoto lenses in TV. You have cranes that move. You have like shots that go on trails of trains. But you also have montage on TV. And I'm not talking about changing the channels, because there's a movie like Natural Born Killers that's supposed to be like you're changing the channels every time you're watching it. You're watching different levels of the channel on everything you view. But with How the West, I mean, with the Wild Bunch, you're considering that the characters are realistic, that this was what the Old West was really like, is something that all Westerns do, compare to themselves with what was the Old Western really like, which is why it's strange that so many of them, even the last one I was showing, are based on Yojimbo and Last Man Standing, and who's going to win the gun duel at the end. And we know in Stagecoach that when John Wayne drops to the ground and shoots 3 dudes at once, that he won the gunfight no problem. That in High Noon, Gary Cooper basically has no help except a little bit out of nowhere in the movie High Noon to kill like 5 of the most hardened, good shot bandits ever, is almost like Tombstone when they clean out like 20 guys with like a whole clean sweep, you know. Those clean sweeps aren't really seen except for in The Godfather when they clean sweep the 5 bosses of the mafia. And in Tombstone, they really rush through like lightning. Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is like Last Man Standing and based on Yojimbo. That John Ford's films were often turned into Kurosawa films is true, but that the 7 Samurai became the Magnificent 7 is also true. And The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly stands out as well as being a Clint Eastwood film that he's in, and he's directing a few years later in Outlaw Josie Wales, actually Play Misty for Me, which is a strange suspense thriller for Clint Eastwood to start on, but that he still makes strange suspense thrillers is true, and usually people don't like him as good as the Westerns, which he retired with Unforgiven in the 90s and dedicated it to Sergio Leone's, and his passing, which was so important to Clint Eastwood to remember, because in these early films, Clint Eastwood discovered how to direct, and although it was like an Italian neo-realist style, done formalistically like a classical Western, is already noticeable in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. That The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is the 3rd part in the Man with No Name series doesn't trademark anything with how they're all 3 about how he unwittingly or wittingly comes to defend an entire town of peasants that need his help, and he pits 2 groups against each other. That he does that in all 3 is not a lie, but how he does it in twisted orders, and he's still part of the same plot in each 3, which is for a fistful of dollars for a few dollars more, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And that, although it's cinematic in ways that we see these televisual codes that we're not ashamed of in Wild Bunch or anything, because we like the way it feels, and that even the remote control issue with Natural Born Killers, where we have to keep resetting the contrast on that film, so it doesn't glare through an old tube TV or whatever. I understand that's frustrating, but some of these westerns like this you can watch on monotone and it still looks like it was shot with a Kodak lens. I mean, you can see the you can see the stains on everyone's teeth from the frickin' cigars they're chewing, and oddly, you can see the stains on my teeth from the cigar we're chewing, and that's because I started watching The Good, Bad, and the Ugly, and it really made me want to smoke cigarettes. And I don't even know if the characters in it smoke or not. I just had to take a break from the movie. I was so stressed out. No, I'm kidding. But he is smoking on the cover, which is totally unpolitically correct and already a sign of Clint Eastwood's total rebellion against and his total anti-authoritarianism, which is carried over from the modern age into the postmodern age, which is that if he wants a big giant cigar hanging out of his mouth, he can have it because he's actually faking in this one that he's shooting at his friend actually to knock him off a noose and collect money for his bounty before he knocks him off the noose, etc. They have a plan to collect treasure. And like the collecting treasure of Wild Bunch, it sometimes works out and somehow doesn't. Now, in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, it all comes to a head when the good guy, the bad guy, and the ugly guy, Eli Wallach, come to this standoff where they're having gun battle. And Long plays the music, and Sergio Leone cuts from far establishing shot to close up in this trinity of standoff that they're having. And that the battle is resolved in ways that you have to see yourself, but that has become one of the most memorable scenes in cinema history because it equalizes everything that's been hierarchicalized before to set up as two different groups opposed to each other. And now it's the three guys that originated setting up the town, and then for a few dollars more that they robbed from the town and gave back to them more money only makes sense that they had stolen the goods that they needed to trade in for the ultimate treasure, and now they're having a shootout over it, the original three guys that set it up, so it wouldn't be them, but that they would be the heroes of a town, or the robbers of a town, or both, because they gave back to the town what they got on another deal. Now, that they gave back to the town what they got on another deal is that the man with no name could be named altruist because he saves the life of the peasants, and he doesn't really have to. That he does is kind of like, well, that's going through the Civil War. You could have a pretty hard time with that, but I'm not going to judge Clint Eastwood for his views. If he wants to smoke a cigar, I'm not going to tell him to stop, even though they're addictive and they're bad for you and they lead to, like, the stockades sometimes. No, I'm kidding, but you're just like, if cigarettes led to that, then, like, they shouldn't have let Clint Eastwood smoke on that cover. So if it's my fault that they give Clint Eastwood away as a smoker, he probably really isn't in real life and probably never lights up because it's a bad habit. But that his character did in the Sergio Leone film, he was probably following strict orders to do so. Anyway, speaking of which, most of the actors were told strictly orders what to do by John Ford, who did carry around his pistol but rarely had to point it, and didn't think of like actors like Jimmy Stewart as like just to be played with and to be played against type, but he does play him somewhat against type by having him blow his top in Liberty Valance is only one sign that he's going to be a shaky shooter because he's made such a threshold guardian enemy out of Liberty Valance. That there are scenes with John Wayne burning down his own ranch, kind of accidentally, but kind of on purpose. Totally leads me to the next point that I've got to make, and I told you I'd have to go off screen for a minute. But there's one film, I said I'd bring this up later, but I see we're coming up to wrap-up time, so there's a couple of films I want to compare. This is one of John Ford's final 1960s films. It's considered one of his best films. But that all of his westerns, from Drums Along the Mohawk to The Seven Women, even Cheyenne Autumn, if you count that as his last true western, even The Iron Horse that I own on DVD, and it's really hard to track down. You have to go on like silentfilm.org and put in a review for it or something to track these down. And sometimes these movies you have to put in a review at the site to tell them how bad you want it, and then they'll market it. And that I wasn't the only one looking for the Ford at Fox collection, because that means he was doing the super westerns at Fox, and that the Indians are again bad guys is already said here by Leonard Maltin. It says this movie invented what later became cliches. And that's because the cowboy and Indian frontiersman episode is so lit up But you can't get past the fact that there are Indians versus cowboys in this movie. And that, like, the fact is, they're trying to stop them from building a train is already civilization's basis for a later book written by Ayn Rand, or was it earlier, around that time, about a train that crossed the whole world. So they probably would have had the transatlantic done in the 1800s, which is what this movie is about. That this movie is about that, and that it comes around the time of Atlas Shrugged is not really that important, because this was a movie strictly about the original building of the train, not the super trains we could maybe conduct in the future. And that it's not sci-fi lends balance to the fact that the Western genre already exists. And basically, because of Méliès and things later adapted by Fouillard and things adapted by Jean Cocteau with his Beauty and the Beast, things merged into fantasy sci-fi. And via UFA with German films like Metropolis, which we'll discuss in full at a later date, but we've talked about Metropolis and how the pleasure garden comes up top and the tempest is the people down below in the city that are working so hard they're falling into a Moloch pit. And this is where we get the sci-fi genre. Although no sci-fi movie, even the remake of the Japanese animation Metropolis, are really ever like Metropolis. All the movies, including Brazil, that have Metropolis's point of view are all bleak, like the city flooding. That the kids live through it and they save the city isn't important in Metropolis because they lost the city anyway. But in the Iron Horse, they prevail over the sinister Indians, and in a totally normal way, they build the biggest railroad of all time, which is given its last drive spike by, I think, Abraham Lincoln, which shows that John Ford was like D.W. Griffith and gave Abraham Lincoln a nod every chance he could get. And that he gave Abraham Lincoln a nod every chance he could get just goes to show that there is always a reason for a strange Abraham Lincoln painting to appear in like an Oliver Stone or a Steven Spielberg movie, who are totally referencing the fact that D.W. Griffith and John Ford are always referencing Abraham Lincoln. Now, the Iron Horse has all of these train sequences, and we've already discussed tonight with a friend that train sequences are the best for moving across large landscapes in movies with a technologically driven reason. That I can only think of the Defiant ones as the one with the train shot where Sidney Poitier is with Tony Curtis and they're trying to get on a train, and it seems unbelievable that one's hanging on by his cuff and trying to get him on, but then that came out in a postmodern way with Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, where they were holding chains on a chain gang trying to get into a train and knocking each other over, is another train gag that all comes from the original Great Train Robbery, which that and Birth of a Nation were John Ford's favorite movies, and that he worked on Birth of a Nation was mentioned. That he was a Klansman in Birth of a Nation, maybe a sensitive subject, as John Ford threatening to kill John Steinbeck for not taking the Pulitzer Prize when he was given it, and John Ford said at gunpoint that he better take it. See, these stories don't make him look so flattering, but some of the stories you hear about directors being gruff are true, but that's why some of them are good directors. Now, I'm not saying that every director is allowed to yell at his cast and treat them as Otto Preminger did in his films, but that John Ford was tough on his characters, maybe not even as much as Werner Herzog was on Klaus Kinski when he held him at gunpoint in Agira, the Wrath of God, which is among the collection that we will be covering in future episodes. But that the Iron Horse sets the pace for all Westerns doesn't surprise me how similar it is to Stagecoach, but how evolved it's come from riding a train across the Old West to riding a stagecoach across the Old West. And if you ride a stagecoach across, you can get through mountain passes that the train wasn't built through, and plus there's latitude and longitude. Only so many trains go in so many directions, and that from top to bottom isn't going to be as far of a travel as left to right in America in general is not necessarily always a rule, depending on how far up the states actually go, like Montana and say. But I'm just saying that driving lengthwise is always usually the idea of a longer trip, although driving height-wise can be longer Don't let the map deceive you the way it's causally out there. And then that there's scenes of the Civil War in Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which is coming out in the same year as Wild Bunch, and that they're both masterpieces of cinema, and that Rio Bravo captures the singing Western guys as the ones who need protected and need help protecting each other, who may have to put each other to death and are in a situation where they have to put to death the guys that are coming to put them all to death. And that means what's going to happen in a Howard Hawks film? The good guys win, but are they good guys? It's questionable, like Stagecoach. It's already brilliant. It's post-war. Stagecoach is right when the war is going to begin. So John Ford's going to have to go back into the war, and then he's going to come out making Westerns. Then he comes out making Westerns like the Cavalry trilogy with Rio Grande, Fort Apache, and She Wore a Yellow Ribbon is the Cavalry trilogy, and that it's post-war, is notorious because his Battle of Midway, which is a battle that Kurosawa, the director of Yojimbo, turned on his own shipmates in Japan, but had to be locked in an American dungeon for a while based on John Ford's assessment that he shouldn't be killed, that he's been his friend making movies, and that he was coming to spy on his own Japanese planes, didn't give them any credulence against the fact that he was Japanese, and that John Ford saved him is a true story that's hard to find in reference books. That it kind of became a legend that other people would have come to both of their rescue is true, and that like they didn't mean to lock him up necessarily, except that was a policy because he came with the battalion and they didn't want him in bad standing with the Japanese. And it's all very confusing, but it all come to a head in Tora 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 when Kurosawa was asked to direct part of it and couldn't because of the fact that it was not like the real thing, and that he would have had to have restaged something like it, and by then nobody really wanted to be reminded of the nuclear bomb after Hiroshima and Mon Amour and all those Night and Fog movies came out and disillusioned us all. We're still going back and saying, isn't Stagecoach awesome the way they cut music to sound? And isn't that why the sound film was invented? So we can have a music track, an animal track, a human track, a track for all the gunshots. Every sound has its own track, and we bunch them all together and put them in these new speakers that are even better than the Jazz Singer, and we all have a good time at the theater. And Man Who Shot for Liberty Valance may not be as big as How the West Has Won, but it's big for 60s Westerns and how it turns the stars that are once known for their good boy attitude in Stagecoach, which is still an outlaw, to their bad boy attitude that they always had, regardless of whether they represent the white scourge of the Western world hat or the black devil of the constant overacted symptom of the Old West is to stage a melodrama. And to stage a melodrama is like what they do in gangster films, only gangster films are more modern. They're based on modern costumes with modern people that go on modern missions. But that the gangster genre flourished before the Western in terms of sound films is fairly true, although we can find B-Westerns around this time, and we can go back to the Covered Wagon even before the Iron Horse and say there's always been these pioneering Western movies. But you look at even Judith of Bethulia or the Squaw Man of the early silent era, features were kind of Westernish, and Birth of a Nation kind of has this whole Civil War, but there's no Indians yet until in that revolution about the American Revolution. America, it's called, by D.W. Griffith, has an Indian in George Washington's court. And I think it's very sad the way the Indians were treated in most movies. And I like Little Big Man and Outlaw Josie Wales for not only being fair to the Indians, for being fair to ethics and saying, this is how we really define ethics in the Old West. The justice are pure, the evil can be removed, and those that don't obey the law of the gun are to perish under the gun, as those that live by the gun will maybe die by the gun, but not always if they're the hero. And even heroes go down in some movies. And all these guys have movies where they get killed in Westerns, and they're all amazing. And that there's thousands of Westerns you can discuss, and that there's some pioneers out there that's seen all the Westerns. And there's somebody that's even seen the 5 Year of the Searchers. He's been there camping out, waking up for every new picture launch when he can take naps. No, I'm kidding. There isn't really someone who's seen all 5 years of the Searchers. But if all 5 years of the Searchers can be seen in 2 hours and 45 minutes, isn't that the whole point of cinema? Although 7 years in Tibet does kind of feel like 7 years in the theater, but I'm not saying that as a bad thing because that would be 2 years longer. And then for that movie to be longer than Out 27, the 27-hour movie by Jacques Rivette, and that would mean not all long movies are westerns, but How the West Was Won is the least of all the westerns, and it's still a great, one of the most powerful, amazing westerns, not just for the John Wayne western moment in the middle of it, or the canoe that Jimmy Stewart builds, etc. Because we're so entertained by the melodrama and some of the comedic values that we see in Rio Bravo that make it a snap punch Marx Brothers comedy at the same time are all in the classical mode of where the studios inherited them. That all studios eventually inherited westerns is a total point we need to cross, because even though it was back when Iron Horse was getting fired up that the westerns were really getting turned on, that's when they shut down, and they were for reasons beyond my research why they took till 39 to come back, although there were intermittent displays of the Old West in the 40s. And I'm not sure to say this, but some of the John Ford films that are in that era certainly seem like they're in some kind of a Old West reality, even if it's kind of Gone with the Wind looking Victorian restoration era, which is weird because they supposedly had a restoration that went terribly awry and the South lost everything. And that's the way Hollywood tells it, is with the Confederacy losing and the North winning, but to what cost? Victory, right? But that's why I like World War I and World War II movies, because it was usually the director that went to the war and fought the war that saw it back to back with how the war was really fought and what was fair and unfair about it. And they had the bravery to show the good and bad of war, because there's always going to be bad, but that there was good at all was because they're good people fighting it. So tomorrow, when you're remembering Veterans Day and Memorial Day, and every holiday should be about soldiers, remember that the only reason we have the freedom to even talk about movies or go to movies is reminded to us in the patriotism of the Western. That these men give their lives to protect and save others makes them soldiers. That's why they're training in the cavalry trilogy at West Point, usually, or a West Point mock-up of these soldiers that give their life for the cause, that they sometimes live through it. More to them for why we love our soldiers, and we love our soldiers of the Old West, and we know most of them were in the war. The soldiers of the Old West fought some of the hardest battles you'll ever see, and that John Ford was there to film it. Well, let me just tell you, the aircraft carrier emerges of the Americans, and 200 Japanese planes are blown out of the sky with no American casualties, and the war turns to America's gain. And I'm okay with westerns that are about that, reflecting that. Heck, even High Noon's reflecting the Blacklist reminds us that, yeah, we don't want to be communists, but do we really abandon everybody over it? Just because we don't like that page of madness thought that somehow we could all go insane from seeing a book by Marx or something, that to touch a book would warp us into another creature? Well, that's probably true, because one time I touched the Necronomicon while I was watching Evil Dead, and a lot of zombies popped out. So that was at Halloween, though. We don't do the Evil Dead movies except once in a while, and they're good craft, and they're good examples of why we think that horror film really emerged in postmodernism at that time, when really the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the end of the modern postmodern line, and that it already drags out into this total ending of cliffhangers. That movie's brought up again to describe the gangster film Scarface, which by pardon is another example of how gangster films are always reinventing themselves, and that it took from the Iron Horse to Stagecoach to reinvent himself. It seems like a long wait, and there's a lot of movies in between, but that the war erupts right after it, and John Ford gives balance to his westerns even after he gets out of the war, is one of the most amazing turns of a director even further into the Western form, and that Howard Hawks did the John Wayne movies as a tribute to John Ford is totally true. And that Howard Hawks was every bit as good with his Big Sleep movie. His Big Sleep movie we'll talk about, and it's really great. And that Howard Hawks did Only Angels Have Wings, which was the John Wayne movie he loved so much. But that John Wayne is a great star, and that he was a good actor in the Howard Hawks movies, and is good at what John Ford wanted to capture of the painterly figurines of the Old West and how they come together in color boxes. Remember, just because it's entertaining, melodramatic, and done on a great train robbery scale of editing is to make it fascinating that there's movement, there's action, there's adventure. Action, adventure, and Westerns have a lot in common. Westerns are usually action adventures almost in every case. Dead Man is still even an action adventure, although it's kind of pined down into the modern, we're alone, no exits kind of way, but a lot of Westerns with Clint Eastwood do face him alone, and face him alone in the screen, and face him alone, and watch him lonely go into the sunset. And that's why he's the man with no name, because he's lonely. I mean, he doesn't have a name because he doesn't have any friends that could even call him a name. The fact that he doesn't have any friends isn't to the avail that he saves everyone and they're ungrateful. It's just that he has to move along, whether he saved everyone or not, because, well, there's been bloodshed, and really it's only a matter of time before it all comes to a head as who gets the last treasure. And while we're pretty sure it's Clint Eastwood, there's no real open-ended about it, but was it worth him going through all that trouble just to get the gold, and then suddenly have everyone flake on him and suddenly say they wanted it, even though he went to all the trouble? That's why we're on his side, but we don't give him a name because we can't be friends with him, because he's got a mission he can never complete. When it's complete, he can really have no friends, but he can't have anybody knowing about it. But how can you have a lot of money without nobody knowing about it? You're anonymous, you have no name. So for a few dollars more than the fistful of dollars he got, he sure got out of there ugly with money, and he's still the good. And we'll have to wait till later to see if it was a B movie in terms of, that's why it says bad, like it's a bad Western. Because we all know there's no such thing as a bad Western, and a bad Western is still a good movie on my day. I'd still put in a bad Western, and I'm not saying they're bad Westerns, but some of the more generic aspects of using a papery set or something can even be redone in a Western way nowadays and look great. But I'm not saying there really is a B movie Western that's inferior to the A is clear. That if it's a bad Western, it's still a great movie is kind of a joke, because you're not saying it's bad. You're saying it's a B movie, and B movie doesn't mean bad, but has come to terms with the fact that it's not as good as an A, so they sometimes say, well, that's a bad B movie, and people think that's a bad movie. But what I'm saying is the similarity and the difference to that comment is that a B movie is actually not A-list, but B-list, and that B starts with bad, makes us all associate it with the exploitation type genre that is oftentimes a B movie, and which in that case you would call it a bad film, whether you're saying it's good or not. So I'll be careful on my qualifiers, not to say that bad is in the title, and that you're going to see some bad things, and that it's bad in a kind of wrong, so wrong that you have to watch it and make sure that that's how bad it gets, is kind of why I'm saying it's intentionally saying it's bad, because it's putting things in it that are, by the way, going to be bad. That's why it's the good, the bad, and the ugly, because there's things that are good, there's things that are bad, and there's things that are ugly, and we've denominated that there's the in front of all of them, so that means the bad. The good movie, the bad movie, and the ugly movie turn into the all three movie, because they all three come to face each other down, which is what we're all waiting for, because we've all seen that clip a million times. But I'm not going to require the viewing of these films as of yet. If you have a way to get a copy of Iron Horse, do yourself a favor and grab a collector's item, because silent films, as always, are some of the biggest collector's item in cinema, whether it's DVD, Blu-ray, preferably a good format, but that they're already doing 4K launches of silent films makes me so insanely jealous that, well, I won't say what I almost did to get it, but, you'd never believe it. So, anyways, all right, well, I'll talk to you guys all later. That was on the soundtrack. It got kind of loud there, I know, for a while, and we had a few interruptions. We're all right. That soundtrack was Satanic Incorporated by Aaron Sheley, which was perfect for the Old West because it's like a horror film soundtrack. And we're talking about the Westerns as though they're like we're going to talk about musicals, which we already have, and Westerns and gangster films. And there are romance movies, and there's action adventure, and there's all these genres, sci-fi, horror. There's genres that follow certain cues, and we've talked about the typography of the gun and the hat, and the typography of the stagecoach and the train, and the typography of the Civil War and the Indians, and how they all match mythologizing the Western style, and that the Western style comes together again in these movies that I've named. Isn't any point to not sit back and watch all the hundreds of others that are wildly craving. And it's like once you've seen one, you have to follow some kind of imprint of the Western is on all of them. And it's hard to tell what it is other than those mythologizing elements. But there's something about how they shoot it and where they shoot it and what they're shooting it about that match up in all Westerns like Louis L'Amour in his books. You can always see a train riding through them all that connects all the stories to a town or a place, and that all the Westerns are connected by these sources that only really the director knows, and the writer knows exactly how it's connected to all other Westerns. Is a wild thing about that genre, because other genres can splice parts of each other in each other, like, with Blackula and everything from the horror genre, but that's blaxploitation too, and that's a complicated issue, and I'm not going to quite get on that. In fact, I'm going to call that a do, because we have other issues to discuss, but there are horror films that merge, and I'm not saying they don't, but that all Westerns merge. Even the Wild Bunch, which is the most modern and offhand version of a Western that has to do with none of the others. Something about how they filmed it based on old Westerns is making me think that even that's the historical basis of what's similar to them all. And it's not just fighting for your treasure, fighting over your treasure, and fighting to get your treasure back. It's that there's confirmed treasure for those that fight for it and get it back. And the payback for those that die for it is a code of the West that we can't describe, because it's not vengeance. It's not despairing bad luck that gets you on a mission in the Civil War that gets you killed. It's by your own instinct, not just to act as a soldier, but to defend the weak and defend those in the mass that are going to get hurt anyway. And that in the Wild Bunch, the mass gets hurt and they have to move on, really means that the mass gets hurt and they have to move on. And that's not just a Vietnam trait of the Wild Bunch. That's Senpak Kampa saying, look, we've done this Wild Bunch thing before, and we're going to do it again. And he did it like it's never been done. And that's my pick for the best Western ever.